execution, death, poverty, and misery. Those were the fates that met the wives of the top-ranking Nazis of the Second World War. Some died inside of the final headquarters of the Führer in Berlin. Others decided not to live in a world without the Reich. But some of the wives of the high-ranking Nazis decided to live out to see what history would say about them in the years after the worst global conflict which their husbands had caused. In this documentary, we look at what happened to the wives of the Nazis, the wives of the commanders of the SS, and other high-ranking officials who brought much terror to the world in the 1930s and 1940s. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. At the end of the Second World War, there was an Allied initiative to try and rid Germany and Austrian society of the Nazi ideology and the politics of the Third Reich. Denazification, as it was known, removed anyone who was a member of the SS or those involved in the running of Germany from their positions, and also Nazi organisations were outlawed and banned. But through vigorous interviews, often the wives of high-ranking Nazis, including war criminals, were classed into one of 5 categories. These were major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and persons exonerated. But many of the Nazi wives had benefited from the Reich and their husbands' positions, meaning they had accumulated huge wealth, living in large houses, profiting from the horrific suffering of those who were being persecuted. Because of this, many of the Nazi wives were classed as some of the most serious offenders in denazification proceedings. In this video, we will now go through many of the Nazi wives and outline their fates in the years after the Second World War. Eva Braun was of course the wife of Adolf Hitler, but within 40 hours of their marriage inside of the Führer bunker within Berlin, both husband and wife lay dead next to each other inside of Hitler's study. Eva Braun had been living in the shadows for many years, and Hitler had wanted to communicate a chaste lifestyle, and he did not want to appear as in a relationship, as he was concerned that this would damage his appeal to women inside of Nazi Germany. Braun had been a photographer's assistant, and her relationship with Hitler was very complex. She had attempted to take her own life a couple of times before to increase Hitler's attention that he would pay her, and she was a significant power inside of the inner circle and within Hitler's mountain retreat to the Berghof. She was by all accounts a vibrant and rather positive person, albeit sometimes rather childish, and she did enjoy the life that Hitler was providing. But of course all of these riches and wealth that she benefited from was stolen from those who were being persecuted. Eva Braun remained loyal to Hitler, and she declared she would remain by his side as she took position inside of the Führer bunker. She travelled there in April 1945 and refused to leave despite Hitler appealing for her to do so, as the Soviet Red Army encircled Berlin. On the evening of the 28th of April 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun did marry inside of a small civil ceremony inside the bunker, and this was witnessed by Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. The couple then had a small wedding breakfast and celebration, but Eva changed her name to Eva Hitler, signing her marriage document with this. At around 3:30 p.m. on the 30th of April 1945, a gunshot was heard from Hitler's study, and when Hitler's SS adjutant entered the room, he saw the lifeless bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun. Braun had allegedly bitten into a cyanide capsule, and Hitler had died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the right temple. The corpses were then gathered in a rug, and they were then carried up through the bunker's emergency exit, and they were placed inside of a bomb crater, doused in petrol and ignited. This is where the story gets incredibly complicated. The remains of Eva Braun, with the exception of dental remains, have never been found, and the remains may have been moved after their cremation, with ashes then being buried somewhere else. There was allegedly a dental bridge of Eva Braun found, identified by her dentist, and the fact that this bridge had a gold filling, as did allegedly Braun. But this dental bridge was actually never fitted, and there was also controversy around this, and it's not known whether the remains of Eva Braun were found, and they could technically, if we believe this, still be buried within Berlin soil somewhere. Being moved in the hours after the death and cremation of Eva Braun, Hitler's then wife. Margarete Himmler was the wife of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS or the Reichsführer SS. She was slightly older than him, and she had been trained and worked as a nurse during the First World War, and inside of specifically a German Red Cross hospital. She had been married before she met Himmler in 1927, and the pair shared an interest in many things, including herbal medicine. They were married in June 1928, and Himmler struggled to reveal his relationship to his parents, as his wife was 7 years older and a divorcee, but also she was a Protestant. None of Himmler's family attended the wedding, and they did have a child, a daughter named Gudrun, together, born in August 1929. Margareta benefited greatly from her husband's rise to power, and the family had many huge houses that they could live inside of, and she saw her duty as the wife of the head of the SS as someone who would hold coffee and tea afternoons with other high-ranking wives of Nazis. But she was not the most popular, and some Nazis even claimed that Heinrich Himmler was dominated by his wife inside of the family home. Margareta Himmler, as the Second World War began, operated a military hospital affiliated with the German Red Cross, and she led some missions into different lands which were being conquered by the Wehrmacht. She was very anti-Semitic and wrote horrific things inside of her diaries, and she reached the rank of colonel in the German Red Cross. But Himmler himself had taken a mistress, and this was his private secretary, Hedwig Potthast. She had 2 children with the head of the SS, but by the end of the war, Himmler and Margareta were living apart, and they last saw each other in April 1945. At the end of the war, Margareta and her daughter Gudrun left Gmund, and they were seized by the US Army in May 1945, and they were held inside of different camps, such as inside of Italy and Germany. Margareta was interrogated, and it was evident that she had not been informed as to the deadly business of the SS. She continued to be interrogated, including at the Nuremberg trials. She was categorised in line with denazification in 1948 as a lesser offender, and she challenged this, claiming her membership to the Nazi Party was nominal and that she was more loyal to the Red Cross. But it was ruled that she supported the Nazis and endorsed her husband's work, and there was even images of Himmler taking his daughter to a concentration camp, but she was then in 1951 lowered in her classification. Margareta Himmler was said to have not been accountable for her husband's crimes, but that she did benefit from her husband's rise, and she was in 1953 reclassified yet again as the second highest as an activist, militant or profiteer. She was sentenced to 30 days punitive work, and Margareta Himmler lost her pension rights and also her right to vote. She lived with her sister in the years after the war, along with her adopted son, and her final days were spent with her daughter in Munich. Margareta Himmler died on the 25th of August 1967 at the age of 73. Martin Bormann was the private secretary of Adolf Hitler, and many people inside of the inner circle referred to him as the Brown Eminence, due to the fact he controlled direct access to Hitler. Bormann would later stab a number of the high-ranking Nazis in the back and bring about their downfalls, and he was for many years married to a woman named Gerda Busch. Gerda Bormann, as she was later known, married Martin on the 2nd of September 1929, and Hitler and Rudolf Hess acted as witnesses. The pair together had 10 children, with the first disturbingly named after his godfather, Adolf Hitler. Gerda Bormann shared her husband's political views, and she did support him, and she also thought a new social order could help spread Nazism, and she did have some strange perceptions and beliefs on the idea of monogamy. She wanted rid of it, and she believed that every male, like her husband, should have the right to legally marry many different women. The husband would then visit the first wife every 2 weeks, and this man would then be encouraged to have as many children as possible. Now Gerda's husband was known for having many affairs with different women, and Gerda Bormann proposed to her husband a marriage based upon this principle, giving him the free rein to sleep with whoever he wanted, and then have children with them. She also wanted equal treatment of illegitimate children in law, and wanted the word adultery banished. Gerda Bormann also believed that every German woman should be obliged to have at least 4 children with one man, and once this had been achieved, the man could then be available to have 4 children with another woman. Her views were shocking, and they were aimed at populating the Reich for Hitler. She benefited a huge amount from her husband's position, and the family had a large amount of wealth and power, but before the Third Reich collapsed, Gerda Bormann fled the family home in South Tyrol, whilst her husband was inside the Führer bunker in Berlin. A few weeks later she was taken to a military hospital, and she was then diagnosed with uterine cancer. She would never see her husband again, as Martin Bormann remained inside of Hitler's bunker and then disappeared during a breakout attempt. On the 23rd of March 1946, Gerda Bormann died from the effects of mercury poisoning, contracted during her chemotherapy treatment. She left her children to be raised by a priest named Theodor Schmitz, and he later adopted them. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Reich Marshal and head of the Luftwaffe, was actually married twice. His first wife, the daughter of a Swedish aristocrat, Karin, had met Göring for the first time at a castle when she was visiting her sister. He was working as a commercial pilot for a Swedish airline, Göring having been an experienced First World War flying ace, and the pair fell in love and continued to meet up. Following their marriage on the 3rd of January 1923, the pair lived together at a hunting lodge. As her husband mixed in circles with the Nazis, Karin joined the party also, and when Göring was injured being shot in the groin during the Munich Putsch, she smuggled him out of Germany to Austria and Italy, where he recovered. Their story was made into a powerful propaganda tool for Hitler, but the story did not end well. In her 40s, Karin was not very well at all, and she suffered from tuberculosis. Following her mother's death, Karin was then struck with grief, and this made her even more ill, and she did travel to Sweden for her mother's funeral, but then she had a heart attack. Göring was by her side as she died of heart failure on the 17th of October. Following her death, Göring created a huge hunting lodge and named it Karinhall after her, and he would inter her remains in a mausoleum on the grounds. Her corpse was later recovered in the 1990s, and her remains were then sent to Sweden for DNA testing, and they were actually found to have been Karin Göring. Hermann Göring later remarried on the 10th of April 1935 to Emmy. She has been referred to as the First Lady of the Reich, and she was given Nazi membership in 1938. The couple had a daughter named Edda, and she was actually named after the daughter of Mussolini. Emmy Göring hosted many state functions in the Göring residences before the Second World War, and this created an intense rivalry with Hitler's girlfriend Eva Braun, and the pair did not get on. In fact, Hitler even ordered Göring to get Emmy to treat Eva with more respect, but Eva was of course very jealous. Emmy Göring received a lot of attention, and her husband, let's remember, was one of the most prominent and ruthless art thieves and looters of the Second World War, and the family became incredibly wealthy. Her husband even celebrated their daughter's birth by flying 500 planes over Berlin to celebrate. Hermann Göring was captured at the end of the war and was later brought to the Nuremberg trials, before he took his own life hours before the hangman would have dispatched him. But Emmy Göring was brought to a denazification court. She was convicted of being a Nazi and was actually locked up in prison for a year. She had 30% of her property confiscated and was also banned from stage for 5 years in any performance. Emmy was, after her release from jail, given a small flat in a building in Munich, and she wrote her autobiography. She suffered with muscle problems in her final years and died on the 8th of July 1973 at the age of 80, and she is today buried inside of Munich's Waldfriedhof. Reinhard Heydrich was one of the most disgusting Nazis of the inner circle, and Hitler even referred to him as the man with the iron heart. He was ruthless and brutal, and he would become a central figure overseeing agencies such as the SD and Gestapo. His wife Lena was a big influence on his life, and she attended a Nazi rally in 1929 seeing Hitler speak. She joined up, and then at the age of 19 in December 1930, she met for the first time Reinhard Heydrich at a rowing club ball. The pair were engaged weeks after meeting for the first time. She did stick by him as he was charged with breaking an engagement promise to a woman he had known before Lena, and Admiral Erich Raeder actually sacked Heydrich from the Navy. It was Lena who persuaded Heydrich to join the SS, and she helped him meet with Heinrich Himmler, who favoured Heydrich from the very first time that they saw each other. He rose quickly throughout the SS ranks, and the pair did have 2 sons. As Heydrich's work took him away for long periods of time, he and his wife did not spend much time together, and the strain almost ended in divorce. The pair did have another child, a daughter, in 1939, and then another daughter was born later. And their final daughter was born shortly after Heydrich died in 1942. He had been assassinated by Czech agents in Prague, and following this, Lena was made a widow. But there was more horror. Her son Klaus died on the 24th of October 1943, having been cycling in the courtyard of their castle, and Klaus rode onto the street and was then hit by a truck. He died from his injuries, but Lena wanted all of those inside of the truck, including helpless passengers, shot. She received a large estate in Bohemia following her husband's death, and she sold further properties and kept a number of prisoners of war working on her estates as forced labourers, and she physically abused them, beating them if they did not want to do something that she wanted. The Heydrich family at the end of the war moved to the island of Fehmarn, and she was at the end of the conflict cleared during denazification proceedings somehow. She also won the right to receive a pension, and she claimed that as her husband was a German police general, she was entitled to his substantial pension too. The government had refused to pay this, but during court proceedings, Lena Heydrich won. She was in the meantime in Czechoslovakia tried as a war criminal in absentia, and was sentenced to life in prison. Later she married a Finnish theatre director and changed her name, and Lena ran the former Heydrich home as a restaurant and inn, but this burned down in 1969. She was made a widow again following her second husband's death in the same year, and she then published her memoirs. She continued to defend Reinhard Heydrich's reputation and denied her husband's involvement in the Holocaust, and she claimed, I quote, "One day Heydrich told me that a decision had been made in Hitler's headquarters to create a big reservation for the Jews in Russia, which could be developed into a Jewish state. Considering the great advancement of the German troops in Russia, everything looked positive. A resettlement of such magnitude appeared possible." She remained completely in denial until Lena Heydrich died at the age of 74 on the 14th of August 1985, and she died an unrepentant Nazi. One of the most well-known wives of the Nazis was Magda Goebbels. When she met her husband, the future propaganda minister Joseph, Magda had already been married to a wealthy industrialist, and she did have a son. The pair met at a Nazi meeting, and she worked at the party headquarters in Berlin, and Goebbels and her became romantically involved from there during a holiday. They formed a relationship, and Goebbels claimed, "We have made a solemn vow to each other. When we have conquered the Reich, we will become man and wife. I am very happy." The pair did have many relationship issues. Joseph was sometimes very jealous, and Hitler grew very close to Magda, and Joseph Goebbels was concerned that the Führer was a romantic threat to him. They did marry on the 19th of December 1931, and Magda was a very ambitious lady. She became the close confidant of Adolf Hitler, and she spoke with him at length about their marriage problems. In 1936, a Czech actress, Lida Barova, had an affair with Joseph Goebbels, and Magda spoke to Hitler about this, and the dictator was furious with his friend, and he ordered Joseph to break it off. The Goebbelses had 6 children, but during the war years, Magda benefited from her close association with Hitler and her husband's position as propaganda minister and Gauleiter of Berlin. But she did in private criticise Hitler, believing that he no longer listens to voices of reason, and she knew that Hitler was leading the German people down a very dark path towards defeat. Magda Goebbels suffered with her health throughout periods of the war, and she was known for having a weak heart and also neuralgia. But in late April 1945, the Goebbels family moved into the upper parts of the Führer bunker, known as the Vorbunker. They would never leave the Reich Chancellery region again. Magda wrote a letter of farewell to her son Harold from her first marriage, and claimed, I quote, "By now we've been in the Führer bunker for 6 days already. Daddy, your 6 little siblings and I, for the sake of giving our National Socialistic lives the only possible honourable end. You shall know I stayed here against Daddy's will, and that even on the last Sunday the Führer wanted to help me get out. You know your mother, we have the same blood, for me there was no wavering. Our glorious idea is ruined, and with it everything beautiful and marvellous that I have known in my life. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not any longer worth living in, and therefore I took the children with me, for they are too good for the life that would follow, and a merciful God will understand me when I will give them salvation. With this, Magda Goebbels had made arrangements for the slaughter of her children, and she had them injected with morphine to knock them out, and then crushed cyanide ampules into their mouths in the days following Hitler's death in the bunker. She did not want her children living in a world without Hitler, despite the fact there had been many offers to get them to safety. She had pre-planned this, also showing her brutal and horrific side. After the death of the Goebbels children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made their way out of the Führer bunker into the garden of the Reich Chancellery, and it was there where they died. There are different accounts as to what happened. One of these is that Joseph Goebbels shot his wife as she consumed cyanide, and then following this their bodies were shot by an SS officer who riddled both of the bodies with bullets. After this, the bodies of the Goebbelses were then doused in a small amount of petrol and were set on fire, but there was not enough to burn the bodies properly, and they were only partially burned, and they were later found by the Soviets on the 2nd of May 1945, and Magda's body was more unrecognisable than that of her husband's. Later, the remains of the Goebbels family were buried in secret in a Smersh facility in Magdeburg, before they were in 1970 exhumed and burned and then crushed once and for all. Rudolf Hess was the strange deputy Führer and loyal friend to Adolf Hitler, who was involved in the creation of the Nuremberg laws and also in writing Mein Kampf. He would during World War II take a bizarre flight to Scotland in a weird peace mission, but he then spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war of the British. Hess was married to Ilse Hess, and the pair had met in 1920. He was reluctant to enter a marriage and a relationship with Ilse, and she actually introduced Hess to Hitler. Hitler pushed Hess into marriage, which occurred on the 20th of December 1927 in Munich. Hitler was the godfather to their son, but during the Second World War her husband's work often left Ilse alone. Ilse Hess left Munich following Hess's flight and arrest, and subsequent shaming in Nazi Germany, and she moved to Hinterland. But at the end of World War II, Ilse was arrested and she was subjected to denazification proceedings and was held inside of an internment camp. She was released in 1948 and settled down and opened up a pension, but she was a devoted and dedicated Nazi, even until the day she died. Ilse Hess spoke out a significant amount about her husband, and she remained loyal to Hitler, and she visited her husband, who had been locked up inside of Spandau prison for the rest of his life. She also supported the secret Stille Hilfe group, who helped to provide support to the Nazis. On the 7th of September 1995, at the age of 85, Ilse Hess died, still a Nazi, in her final moments. Albert Speer was the architect of Adolf Hitler, who the Führer loved spending time with. Speer was given huge commissions, and he constructed the Reich Chancellery and other huge Nazi installations. Speer in 1922 began to court a lady named Margareta Weber, and she was the daughter of a craftsman. Their relationship at the time attracted criticism from Speer's mother, and she believed he was marrying beneath his station and class. The two married in Berlin in August 1928, and Margareta did win over the Speer family. The couple had 6 children together, but Speer, as the Nazis rose to power, became very distant from his family and wife, and he spent more time schmoozing with the Nazis than he did playing with his children and seeing his wife. Even after his release from Spandau prison in 1966, he remained distant, and Speer actually died in London in the company of a woman who he had been having a relationship with. He had remained married, but the marriage was nothing, and he had not seen his wife for many years. Rudolf Höss was the commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp, who oversaw the construction of the site to become the deadliest camp of mass slaughter in World War II. Höss married Hedwig Hensel on the 17th of August 1929, and they had 5 children. He did move his wife and family into Auschwitz, and they lived in a huge villa and had servants in the form of some prisoners who were ordered to serve the commandant's family. Hedwig Höss would later claim that she never knew what was happening inside of the camp, but her children and she were known for treating the servants they had terribly. Hedwig received the final letter from her husband, and they had been partially separated, as he had an affair with allegedly a prisoner of Auschwitz that led to his removal from power. This final letter, sent days before Höss's death, said, Based on my present knowledge, I can see today clearly, severely and bitterly for me, that the entire ideology about the world in which I believed so firmly and unswervingly was based on completely wrong premises and had to absolutely collapse one day. And so my actions in the service of the ideology were completely wrong, even though I faithfully believed the idea was correct. Now it was very logical that strong doubts grew within me, and whether my turning away from my belief in God was based on completely wrong premises. It was a hard struggle, but I have again found my faith in God. That was Hearst's final letter to his wife. But in the years before, Hedwig Hearst had been instrumental in her husband's arrest. Hearst had gone on the run following the end of the Second World War, and he was one of the most wanted war criminals, and his wife gave over information that he was living secretly as a gardener in Gottrupel. Their wedding ring, which had their names intertwined engraved within the ring, was the evidence that brought Hearst into custody. Hedwig Hearst later moved to America and changed her name following her husband's execution, and she lived out the rest of her life very quietly, dying in 1989. The wives of the top-ranking Nazis benefited greatly during their husbands' time in power alongside Adolf Hitler. They would be gifted huge sums of money and also large properties. In the years after the Second World War, many of them lived quiet lives, still devoted secretly to the regime that granted them so much wealth, and they did remain loyal to their husbands, despite the fact many of them had affairs and were involved with many other women. The fates of the Nazi wives were certainly varied, but some lived very long lives and died unrepenting Nazis, just like their husbands. For them, Nazism was a way of life that did not die with them. The wives of the Nuremberg Nazis were mostly locked up inside of prisons, whilst their husbands were on trial. Most of the wives of the high-ranking Nazis were, as mentioned, brought to denazification proceedings after the war, and they were seen as beneficiaries of the suffering of so many people. They were all assessed, and they were then given differing punishments, if any. Most of these women had lived incredibly lavish and grand lives, whilst the Third Reich was in power, accumulating huge amounts of wealth and influence, and then they became celebrities. Huge parties took place in which they attended on the arms of their husbands, but as the end of the war came around, some tried to flee to save their lives. We will now look at the different wives of the Nuremberg Nazis and look at what happened to them. Please note I have omitted the wives of those Nazis who were acquitted from this video, and I will be outlining the fates of those condemned Nuremberg defendants' wives and also the wives of those men who received prison sentences. Karl Dönitz was the Grand Admiral, who became the Reich President following the death of Adolf Hitler. He was someone who at Nuremberg had very clever defence lawyers, and despite being accused of war crimes and other charges, his lawyers managed to turn the charges back on the prosecution, stating that if he was tried for some of them, then the British and other Navy officers should face the same treatment. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment at Spandau prison, but in May 1916 he married a nurse named Ingeborg Weber, and the pair had 3 children. 2 of these, sons named Klaus and Peter, died in action during the Second World War. Ingeborg Dönitz, following her husband's release from prison, accompanied him, and they then reunited. She lived for some years with her husband and died on the 2nd of May 1962 at the age of 68. She was buried inside of the local Armüller cemetery, close to where she died. Hans Frank was the head of the general government in German-occupied Poland, and he was a long-standing member of the Nazi Party. Frank was a member of Hitler's cabinet also, and he was involved in the persecution and slaughter of so many people inside of Poland. He oversaw 4 extermination camps, and for his crimes was sentenced to death and was hanged by Nuremberg executioner John C. Woods in October 1946. On the 2nd of April 1925, he married Brigitte Herbst, a secretary in Munich, and they had together 5 children. Brigitte was known for being dominating over her husband, and she referred to herself as the Queen of Poland. They had a very unhappy marriage, and Brigitte had many affairs, and Hans Frank tried to divorce her in 1942. She tried to save the marriage to remain the First Lady of the General Government, and she stated that, "I'd rather be widowed than divorced from a Reichsminister, but her husband regarded her as his enemy. Adolf Hitler even personally banned Frank from divorcing his wife. After the war she was arrested and she expected to be shot, and was released from prison in 1948, and all her assets were confiscated. She published a book which her husband had written inside of Nuremberg prison, but died relatively poor inside of Munich in March 1959. Wilhelm Frick is often considered one of the more forgotten, condemned Nuremberg Nazis, and he was the Interior Minister of the Nazi Party. He was condemned to death and hanged for his involvement in crafting the persecuting laws of the Nazi Party, and as the war went on he did lose favour, but was still hanged inside of Nuremberg prison's gymnasium. In 1934 Frick married Margareta Naumburg. She was his second wife following a nasty divorce, and was actually the former wife of a Nazi Reichstag MP. The pair had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Now, I've not been able to find out what happened to her in the years after the Second World War. Presumably for her husband's role in the Nazi Party, she was subjected to denazification, but it is known that she died in 1960, 14 years after her husband had gone to the gallows. Walter Funk was the president of the Reich Bank, and he oversaw the huge mobilisation of the German economy for the rearmament of the nation and also in preparation for the war. He also was involved in the arrangement of forced labour inside the concentration camps, and he was, despite his crimes, sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released for poor health from Spandau prison in 1957 and died 3 years later. In 1920 he married Louise Schmidt-Sieben, and she died in 1960. She is another one of those wives of the Nuremberg defendants that little is known about, and it's not known what happened to her in the days after the Second World War. Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht High Command, was also executed at the end of the Nuremberg trials. Specifically, he was sent to the gallows for the fact he signed the Commando and Commissar orders, illegal orders that resulted in the executions of thousands. He was married twice, and his first wife, Irma Grafin von Bülow, died in 1944 during the war. He didn't wait too long and then married another woman named Louise von Bender, and they married in the final months of the war. His second wife, Louise Jodl, later defended her husband's behaviour at the surrender, and she said, "I knew my husband and his iron will, hot heart and sobering reasoning," and Louise Jodl remained loyal to her husband during the Nuremberg trials. Whilst he was imprisoned, she waved a white scarf outside of his window to show that she was still there every day. She was actually involved in the defence of her husband, but she could not save him. She had worked during the war as a secretary at German embassies, but it is not known necessarily what happened to her following her husband's execution. She did die in 1998, living to the age of 93. Wilhelm Keitel was the chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the supreme high command of the German armed forces. Keitel was a lackey and a yes-man who Hitler greatly enjoyed the company of, and Hitler did fly off the handle at him at times. Keitel married Lisa Fontaine in 1909, and she was the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Together they had 6 children, but one died in infancy. It has been reported that Lisa was beautiful and intelligent, and had high ambitions for her husband, but she was also an ardent and virulent Nazi, and a strong supporter of Hitler. Wilhelm Keitel was also executed following the Nuremberg trials, and it's not known what happened to Lisa Fontaine, and what she did after her husband's death. She did die at the age of 71, on the 14th of October 1959. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the most senior member of the SS who was brought to the Nuremberg trials, and he served as the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, overseeing the Gestapo, Kripo and SD. He married Elisabeth Eder on the 14th of January 1934, and the couple had 3 children. He had many mistresses also, and many illegitimate children, but all of Kaltenbrunner's children did survive the war. Elisabeth Kaltenbrunner was involved in the escape of her husband, and she hid out in the woods and refused to tell the authorities where her husband had gone. She was herself arrested and was interrogated, and she gave over a photo of her husband, which was used to identify him. She died at the age of 93 in May 2002, and her husband was also executed on the gallows. It's not known what she did specifically after the war, presumably living a rather quiet life inside of Austria, and she is buried inside of the St. Barbara Cemetery in Linz, Hitler's hometown. Despite no decision being reached for his case, Robert Lai, the chief of the German Labour Front, was actually indicted and he was brought to trial. Lai, controversially it's believed, could have possibly been excused from the Nuremberg trial, as he was someone who suffered with mental issues, which came around presumably following an injury he got during the First World War. After this injury, Lai spoke with a stammer, and he was known for his erratic behaviour and heavy drinking, which made things worse. Later investigations of his brain showed he had lesions on it. He married the rather beautiful Inga Spilker in 1938, however in 1942 she took her own life, and the unhappy marriage was presumably a huge thing in this decision. Adolf Hitler was allegedly very fond of Inga, and there are images of her and the Führer together, and following her death he wrote a heartfelt letter to Robert Lai expressing his condolences. Inga Lai's body was buried in the oak grove of the family home, near to where she died, but as the Second World War came to an end, her husband had the home pulled down and then set on fire. It's believed that Inga Lai's body still lies in the village of Gut-Rotland. However, her husband died by his own hand inside of his Nuremberg prison cell. Konstantin von Neurath was the foreign minister of Germany from 1932 to 1938, and during World War II he did serve as the Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was during the Nuremberg trials sentenced to 15 years, and he did get an early release. He married in 1901 to Maria August Mirza von Filsek. She was very well off, and her great-grandfather was the 4th governor of New York. She managed to see her husband's release from prison, and they reunited, but she died on the 24th of January 1960 at the age of 84, and was buried in Württemberg in Germany. Erich Raeder was the chief of the German Navy High Command, and he attained the highest naval rank of Grand Admiral, and led the Kriegsmarine for the first half of World War II. At Nuremberg he was sentenced to life imprisonment, and was released early due to poor health in 1955. He was married twice, and Erika Raeder helped her husband walk out of Spandau, and she led a campaign to have her husband freed from prison. She made very exaggerated claims to newspapers, claiming her husband's life in prison was oppressive and that he was forced to do hard labour. The reality was that Erich Raeder worked in the prison library just sorting out books. She claimed that the treatment we Germans had to endure is worse than anything that happened to those who were persecuted. The German press helped her case, and German veterans got involved with demands to free Erich Raeder being sent to the US, British and French governments. She did help her husband's cause, but died shortly before her husband in 1959 at the age of 71. Joachim von Ribbentrop was the Nazi foreign minister, and his power and influence dwindled as the Second World War raged on. He was married to Anneliese Ribbentrop-Henkel, and she was to begin with in opposition to her husband's political beliefs. Her parents did not want her to marry von Ribbentrop, but the pair went through with it regardless. She has been described as a very headstrong and stubborn woman, and she dominated her husband, and it was said that she wore the trousers in this relationship. She was controlling, and she urged her husband to become a Nazi later on. Hitler even acknowledged the fact that Anneliese was the powerful one in the von Ribbentrop household. Her husband was sentenced to death and was the first hanged in the Nuremberg executions, but Anneliese von Ribbentrop remained towards the end of the war a strong Nazi, and she was imprisoned inside of the former Dachau concentration camp. She had her wealth and fortune confiscated, but this was then partially returned to her, and she also wrote many books and articles defending her husband. She spent a lot of money on legal proceedings aimed at defending her husband's name, and she tried to recover his estates. She died at the age of 99 on the 5th of October 1973 in Wuppertal, Ebenfeld, and she is buried in a cemetery. Interestingly, her husband's name is on the gravestone, but no body exists for him in the grave, just Anneliese's. He was one of the most influential Nazis, and is also one who is very much forgotten about, but Alfred Rosenberg helped to write the Nazi policies and set the ideology of the party. He was a Nazi theorist and outlined the racial policies, and he held different roles during the war, but he was also sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials and was executed. Rosenberg was married twice, and in 1925 he married his second wife, Hedwig Kramer. He remained married to her until his execution, and they did have 2 children. However, she died in 1947. It's not known specifically the circumstances around her death. Fritz Sauckel was a Nazi Gauleiter, and he was also condemned to death during the Nuremberg trials, being executed by hanging. He was also the General Plenipotentiary for labour deployment. He had 10 children with his wife, Elisabeth Wenzel. She was regularly at his trial, and she believed that her husband was wrongly put to death for his crimes. She was later tried as a Nazi and was brought to denazification court, and was outlined to have been a lesser Nazi, and was fined the value of 1,000 marks. The court told her that you can best thrash out your sins by going home and educating your children democratically, and she was actually the first Nazi wife tried. She was also placed on probation for 3 years. The wife of Baldur von Schirach, the Hitler Youth leader, was known to have on at least one occasion directly challenged Adolf Hitler. Henrietta von Schirach may have even been the target of Hitler's affections at one point. She wrote that, "Finally, to my surprise, Hitler asked me with a very serious air, 'Will you kiss me?' I was chiefly struck by the fact that he had said 'see' to me for the first time in our acquaintance. Yet as he put his face down to mine, I said no. He turned around and went out, closing the door behind him." She later, in 1943, confronted Hitler about the slaughter of Jewish people, and this embarrassed the Führer, and the incident was recounted by those who witnessed it. At the end of the war, Henrietta saw her husband, the former Hitler Youth leader, sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was interred inside of a women's camp and was released in early 1946. She was charged by a denazification court and was fined 200 marks. Whilst her husband was inside of Spandau prison, she filed for divorce, writing a final letter to him, saying, "As always, you would not face the facts. Had I taken poison, it would have saved me untold suffering in my fight to live and keep my children alive. I have expressed my feelings so many times before to you, but you have always preferred to ignore them as being distasteful. Reality has always been distasteful to you. I intend to divorce you immediately." She later brought back artwork confiscated from her husband's possessions, but many of these pieces had been stolen from persecuted people. She also wrote 3 books and died in January 1992. Another lesser-known Nazi, but one who faced the gallows, was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Chancellor of Austria and later Reichskommissar of the occupied Netherlands. He brought in a reign of terror to the country. He married Gertrude Maschka in 1911, and they had 3 children. I've been able to find out little about her and her life, but some of her jewellery, complete with a swastika ring, has recently come up for auction and been sold. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect at the end of the Second World War, escaped the hangman's gallows, and he tried to then make out that he was a good Nazi. This was not the case, and he had been involved in the intense slave labour organisations. He was married to Margaret Weber. Speer's mother thought he was marrying below his station, but upon his release from prison, Albert Speer and his wife did reunite briefly. But he liked the company of other women, and he actually died whilst in the company of another woman in London. Margarete Speer died at the age of 82 in Heidelberg, and she is buried in the Berg Friedhof and is interred in the Speer family grave. Her body is buried there, and her husband's ashes are also interred in this plot. Julius Streicher was the virulent publisher of Der Stürmer, a newspaper that spread terror and hatred all across Germany. He became a multi-millionaire, and he went to the hangman's gallows as strong a Nazi as he had ever been. His wife was Kunigunde Roth, the daughter of a baker, and they had 2 sons together. She, along with a number of other Nazi wives in this video, is one woman who has seemingly little information out there about her. We know her husband had a brutal fate inside of the execution chamber, but it's not known what happened to Mrs. Streicher. The wives of the Nuremberg Nazis had varied fates. Some defended their husbands following their deaths and others were dragged to denazification courts for their own crimes. The fate of some of these women still remains a mystery today, as they quietly remained in the shadows at the end of the Second World War. Josef Kramer was known as a Beast of Belsen, and was a commandant of Auschwitz II-Birkenau and also Bergen-Belsen. He had been rather senior at various other concentration camps, but his work at Belsen saw the camp fall into ruin, with disease running rampant and riot across the site, with hundreds dying each day. Belsen became very overcrowded, and it was here where Anne Frank died. It's believed Kramer must have been responsible for more than 400,000 people's deaths, and he was married to Rosina Kramer. The pair were married on the 16th of October 1937, and Rosina would testify for her husband at his war crimes trial. She said, "Except for short intervals, I've always been with him, although of course when he was on duty, he was in the camp. I went inside the concentration camp on Sundays off-duty days. I went to Auschwitz in 1944, 2 weeks after my husband. The commandant of Birkenau before my husband took over was Hauptsturmführer Hartgenstein. 3 days prior to my husband taking over, I asked Hartgenstein why my husband has been chosen for Auschwitz. His answer was because of the rank my husband held, and there was a general change of commands. She knew exactly what was going on inside the camps her husband oversaw, and she said when asked, 'Did you ever go to Belsen?' She replied, 'One Sunday afternoon, I went into the place where they were weaving, and my husband told me with great pride about the beautiful orchestra which was playing. He wanted to show me that. There was a band, but they had no instruments, so my husband asked for instruments from Auschwitz to be sent to Belsen, so that these girls should be able to play at least something.' She would claim that her husband never treated anyone poorly, and that his duty was to take care of the inmates, which he did day and night. She also admitted she had knowledge of the gas chambers, and that her husband had admitted it was wrong what he was doing. But Josef Kramer was responsible for the scores of deaths, and the conditions at Belsen which caused horrific mass killing, and these were ultimately responsible to him. Rosina, following Josef's execution, would change her name and become a teacher, and she then retired and moved in with her son, and it's believed she lived in the area of Bergen-Belsen, close to the concentration camp her husband horrifically oversaw. One woman who was arguably more infamous than her husband was Ilse Koch, the wife of the commandant of Buchenwald, Karl Otto Koch. Karl is remembered for being the man who oversaw a horrific concentration camp. However, he was prosecuted for embezzling money from the Nazis. For this, he was executed at his own camp. He and his wife Ilse built huge projects at Buchenwald for their own personal gain, including a huge horse riding arena. In this, Ilse would parade on her horses, and if any prisoner looked at her, she would order them to be sent to their deaths. She was known for being involved in terrifying experiments, and she was also completely barbaric. Despite being the mere wife of a commandant, she became known as a witch of Buchenwald, and she beat many of the prisoners. After the war, Ilse Koch was placed on trial for her crimes, but was sentenced to prison time. However, this was reduced to 4 years, as there was an issue with proving if she selected inmates to be exterminated, so she could take their tattooed skin to make artefacts with. But then later in 1945 she was rearrested and was tried the following year. 250 witnesses testified against her, and she was then sentenced to life imprisonment for her crimes. A forgotten commandant of Auschwitz is Arthur Lieber Henschel. Much is documented about Rudolf Höss, but Lieber Henschel was a man who succeeded Höss when he was forced away briefly from the camp. He continued the mass exterminations and executions, but removed torture devices such as the standing cells, and also stopped the selections of regular prisoners. He was regarded as much more lenient in his running of the camp, but still thousands of people were dying each week under his command. He was married to his first wife, a woman named Gertrude, and they had 1 son and 3 daughters. The youngest daughter was born in 1943, shortly before her father became the commandant of Auschwitz. Her mother was awarded the Bronze Mother's Cross by Hitler to women who had 4 or more children. The story of Gertrude, Arthur Lieber Henschel's first wife, is tragic. She lost her husband to another woman, was then arrested at the end of the war, being the wife of an SS officer. She then suffered with her mental health and was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and she was placed inside a mental health facility. Lieber Henschel's second wife, Anneliese, gave birth to a son, and little is known about her. It's unclear how much these women knew about their husband's involvement in Auschwitz, and specifically his work that he did there. An SS officer who served as a commandant of a number of concentration camps was Max Koegel. Koegel would be in charge of Lichtenburg, Ravensbrück, Majdanek and also Flossenburg, and he was seen as a reliable and efficient killer. He was involved in the installation of gas chambers at Majdanek, but he also oversaw the labour camp for women at Lichtenburg, and then the all-female concentration camp of Ravensbrück. He married Anna Zilasek when he was an adjutant with the SS at Dachau. Anna wrote she had aspired to become a professional singer, but blamed her father's Jewish employer for their financial hardship, which forced her to become a receptionist and a nursery school teacher. She worked as a waitress where she first met Max Koegel, and Anna went with him to a number of different concentration camps. They were the first residents in the commandant's house at Ravensbrück, which was a newly built large villa with a big garden sat on a ridge overlooking the site. She was described by the prisoners there as an unpleasant character, and during one event when she went to the hair salon at Ravensbrück, she said the workers were disgusting. After the war, Koegel died by his own hand, and Anna remarried. Fritz Sören was also the commandant of Ravensbrück concentration camp, and his policies were to exterminate the women through working them to death without feeding them much food. He gave prisoners over for experimentation, but his wife, Elfriede, was a different woman. She was a seamstress and married Fritz Sören when he was a lowly SS personnel officer. But when he became the commandant of Ravensbrück, the couple moved into the villa on the ridge. His wife was softly spoken and was very faithful to her husband. It's not entirely known what crimes she committed, if any, at the camp, but Sören after the war was captured. He was tried and was executed for his crimes, but Elfriede stayed loyal to her husband and approached many former prisoners to testify on his behalf. However, after her husband's execution, she even approached his former mistress and said she should apply for an orphan's pension for the daughter she had with Sören. She was a rather loyal lady, but very strange. The wives of the commandants of the concentration camps lived rather bizarre lives. For example, Rudolf Hirsch's wife was seemingly living a normal life, whilst her husband went to work and committed murder and slaughter on an industrial scale. They had a varied involvement in the camps where their husbands ruled over with an iron fist, and many of the wives of the commandants were seen as witches or as evil cogs in the system. Ilse Koch, for example, spent the majority of her life after the war behind bars. Adolf Eichmann was one of the major organisers of the Holocaust, and he has been referred to as the architect of it. Eichmann rose throughout the SS, and his crimes were mostly centred around organising and overseeing deportations of hundreds of thousands of people to concentration and extermination centres, including Auschwitz, where they were slaughtered inside the gas chambers. In March 1935, Eichmann married a lady named Veronika Liebel, and the couple had 4 sons. Eichmann actually was arrested at the end of the war, but he did manage to escape and travelled to Argentina, where he lived out for many years under a false name. He was then kidnapped by Mossad agents in 1960 and was brought to trial, and he was then executed. His wife would make a request to see her husband months before his execution one final time, and the request was accepted, and the pair met again. There were many secrets inside of the Eichmann home within South America, and his wife had joined her husband to live in their home. After her husband's execution, she returned to Europe and Germany, leaving her life in South America behind her. But in November 1997, Vera Eichmann died at the age of 88 in Württemberg. Kurt de Luger was a senior member of the SS, and he was the chief of the Order Police, and during the war he had a huge number of police officers under his control. He also later committed many war crimes inside of occupied lands, including in Czechoslovakia. In October 1926, de Luger married Kathy Schwartz, who would become a member of the Nazi Party, and the pair would later adopt a son. De Luger's wife had 3 children with her husband. In 1943, Kurt de Luger had a huge heart attack, and his wife nursed him back to health on their huge estate in western Pomerania, which had been given to them by Hitler. Little is known about what happened to Kathy de Luger following her husband's execution, and it's presumed that now she is dead. Hermann Fegelein has been described as one of the most evil members of the SS. He was a high-ranking commander in the Waffen-SS and committed a massive amount of war crimes with his cavalry units. He was also the brother-in-law of Eva Braun, Hitler's girlfriend and later wife, and he married Gretel Braun in 1944. The marriage was huge and took place in the presence of Hitler. Her husband was somewhat of a flirt, who even enjoyed spending time with Eva Braun, his sister-in-law, and Hermann Fegelein would be shot within the Reich Chancellery Garden on the 28th of April 1945 inside of Berlin. Gretel Braun gave birth to a daughter roughly a week later at Obersalzberg, and she named this child after her sister Eva. At the end of the war, Gretel Braun would remarry in Munich and died in 1987 at the age of 72. So the wives of many SS commanders at the end of the Second World War did live in obscurity, and many knew about the true crimes of their husbands. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.